In more than 30 countries, people have taken to the streets to protest the rising price of food. And according to some estimates, 100 million people have been pushed to the brink of severe malnutrition. The reasons for this crisis are complex. Coming up on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
In Egypt, army units are baking bread for the poor. Kazakhstan is hoarding sunflower seeds. And in Mexico, office workers are cutting back on tortillas. While no place has been immune to the food crisis, it is vast numbers of poor who are suffering the most by far.
I've called the food crisis the perfect storm because it has so many factors coming together.
Some describe the crisis as a toxic mix of market failures, political gridlock, and environmental stress. But what are the actual causes? Food production costs have soared. In the first half of 2008, U.S. farmers saw fuel prices jump 40% and fertilizer go up 60%. But a report by the World Bank says the biggest factor driving 75% of the increase was biofuels, crops like corn and soybeans being used to power a new generation of cars and energy equipment instead of feeding hungry mouths.
To use 30% of the U.S. maize production for biofuel, frankly speaking, is not very helpful.
Others say the real culprit is global prosperity. The growing ranks of middle-class steak eaters in China and India.
It's a good thing. We like to see increasing consumer demand and increasing disposable income so that people begin to buy more food.
With every extra pound of porterhouse requiring 7 extra pounds of feed, the worldwide demand for grains has soared. Then there's the issue of subsidies. In the U.S., as well as the EU, Japan, and other wealthy nations, the government effectively pays farmers to grow crops. This keeps the farms afloat, but drives small farmers in poorer countries out of business. Meanwhile, protectionist policies aren't helping things. Pakistan has clamped down on exports. The Philippines is stockpiling rice. As a result of all this, humanitarian aid agencies are struggling to replenish emergency stocks.
50 cents a day, $50 a year to save a child and their family and get them educated and fed. To me, those are possible, tangible numbers.
How big is the problem, and what can be done to curb skyrocketing food prices? Running Out, the global food crisis, coming up next on Great Decisions.
Now from our studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Joining us today to discuss the global food crisis are Lester Brown, president of the Earth Policy Institute, and Professor Joachim von Braun, Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Unfortunately, food crisis issues, malnutrition, poverty have been with us for a very, very long time. Can you kind of characterize the state of the world these days with regard to the food crisis, Lester?
Well, for some decades after World War II, indeed up until the last few years, the number of hungry people in the world was declining. Now it's turned up, and it's projected to go up even further. We're facing what some have referred to as a perfect storm in the world food economy. On the demand side, we're continuing to add 70 million people a year. You don't have to be an agronomist to know if you do that long enough, you'll eventually be in trouble. We have probably close to 4 billion people in the world trying to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. And we have, in the United States, a massive increase in the conversion of grain into fuel for cars. In the 2008 harvest of roughly 400 million tons, over 100 million will be going to fuel for cars.
In the U.S.?
In the U.S., which is about 5% of the world grain harvest. So it's an important diversion. On the supply side, We have spreading water shortages. In fact, in countries that contain half the world's people, water tables are falling. And that includes the big three grain producers, China, India, and the United States. And we also have the loss of cropland to non-farm uses, whether it's residential developments marching up the Central Valley in California or the thousands of factories being built every year in the Yangtze Basin of China. We're losing some of the world's best cropland to these developments. We're also faced with soil erosion in many parts of the world that's undermining land productivity. So on both the supply side and the demand side, we have these convergence of trends that are making it very difficult now to improve the world's nutritional condition.
Lester, you referred to the perfect storm scenario. Storms comes from the heavens. The problem of this storm was that it is largely man-made. It's made through bad policies in the areas which have already been mentioned, bad agricultural energy policy, long-term neglect of agricultural investment. The world, the rich world and the poor world, and the development agencies have neglected the investment that facilitates environmentally sustainable agricultural growth. The research and development was neglected. And the nutrition programs in schools and in early childhood were also not scaled up sufficiently. So the world was hit unprepared, and out of that has come immense suffering.
We had an opportunity at Great Decisions to speak with a number of other experts as well, and all of them have mentioned this perfect storm scenario. Let's hear what they have to say.
First, we have the rise of the middle class in China and India. A lot of people have been talking about that, and it does matter. Those countries have been growing at 5, 10, in some cases even faster for years now. And it's a good thing that many people have escaped poverty. As they do, they want to eat more, and they want to eat more energy-intensive food. They want more meat, which requires more wheat or rice or other staples to produce.
Another one is the rising prices for fuel. And fuel affects food in many ways. It's the processing, it's the transportation, it's one of the inputs into fertilizer. So it increases the costs of all of the areas around food.
Unfortunately, since about 2005, productivity is coming down every single year. And part of it is because we don't use all the technology which is available.
These things came together to start driving up the price of food more quickly than we've ever seen before in history.
Now, I think what many people would find it interesting here is that suddenly the United States and other wealthy Western nations, industrialized nations, are in the same crisis mode as countries that I think people in the Western world would have said, no, they're in a different world. But suddenly people in China and the United States are having the same problem. People in India and the United States are having the same problem with food. Does this create a common interest to solve the problem, or are there forces that are sort of working against solving the problem? Joachim?
It's interesting to note that China and India have responded first, before the West and before the development agencies have responded. They have increased their agricultural investments quite dramatically, with 20 to 30% each in 2008. The planning for that started in 2007, when most of the industrialized nations were still hoping it would go away. And so they were planning to act when the G8 meeting took place in 2007, and this wasn't on the agenda yet. It came to the G8 agenda in 2008, really, only.
Lester? What about this issue of the rich and the poor kind of feeling it together in some strange ways?
The straw that broke the camel's back in this perfect storm scenario we've been talking about is the massive diversion of grain to fuel for cars in the United States. That has the fact that we can now convert grain into oil, in effect, grain into ethanol, has tied the price of grain to the price of oil. And as the price of oil goes up, the price of grain follows. If the food value of a grain drops below the fuel value, the market will move that grain into the energy economy. What we are now seeing is competition between the 860 million people in the world who own automobiles and who want to maintain their mobility, and they don't much care where the fuel comes from, who are competing with the 2 billion poorest people in the world who are trying to get enough food to sort of keep body and soul together. When you look at the average incomes of these two groups, the average income of those who own automobiles in the world is somewhere around $30,000 a year. The average income of the poorest 2 billion people in the world is more like $3,000 a year. So we can see that's not a very even competitive playing field. And unless we can address this issue, and the European Parliament already has, they've reduced the renewable fuel standard from 10% to 5% to reduce pressure on converting agricultural commodities into fuel. We haven't done that yet in the United States, but that's something we need to do.
Am I wrong, or aren't we still producing more food in the world than there is a demand for?
Actually, we need to be specific what we mean by food. If we mean calories, Ralph, you're right. There are enough calories going around in the world to feed everyone. But if we are talking healthy diet with sufficient micronutrients, vitamin A, iron, and so on, we don't have enough going around, even if we would split it up equally. There are about 2 billion people who suffer from this type of hunger, micronutrient. We call it silent hunger, deficiencies. So we need to increase productivity, but not just for the bare minimum, the bread and the rice. We need to increase productivity along the whole food chain, and for producing quality diet, which is affordable for poor people. And that requires a different approach, a much more complex green revolution today than simply increasing the pile of rice. We don't have the right instruments in place for that at this stage. The research and development investments of private and public sector are too small.
You know, both of you have talked about market forces in the last few minutes, and that puzzles me a little bit. I mean, people used to say, well, the market will solve these problems. If there's more food, it'll go to places that need the food, so on and so forth. But the market seems to be actually acting perversely in this situation. It's exacerbating the problem rather than helping it.
Well, Joaquin mentioned the enormous difference in incomes between the wealthy countries and the poor countries. But beyond that, when I buy a loaf of whole wheat bread in the local supermarket in Washington, D.C. for $3, it has maybe 30 cents worth of wheat in it. If the price of wheat doubles, the loaf goes up to $3.30. I may complain, but it doesn't threaten my survival. But if you live in India or Pakistan and you buy wheat in the market as wheat, bring it home and grind it into flour and make chapatis, if the price of wheat doubles, your food price doubles. So we're insulated by a lot of processing and in between things, but people in developing countries are not. They buy rice as rice and wheat as wheat, corn as corn or corn meal. The other thing to keep in mind, just to sort of bring the food versus fuel thing down to the micro level, the grain required to fill one SUV tank, 25-gallon tank, with ethanol will feed one person for a year. So this is a major new stress and source of demand, a new claim on the world's land and water resources that I think we're going to have to deal with.
Now, both of you have talked about the fact that people at the lowest end of the spectrum suffer the most from all this. We talked about that with some of our other experts at Great Decisions as well. Let's hear what they have to say.
In the U.S., on average, people spend perhaps 10% of all their income on food. In many parts of the developing world, a household will be spending 50 or 60% of its income on food, and in some cases even more. If food prices go up by 50%, there just isn't that much room to ensure that people can feed their children.
What that means for many people is they've gone from 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day, now to 1 meal a day, and they've lost all the nutrition content in their diet.
We used to invest heavily in agriculture. We became complacent because food prices were low around the world and it was available and affordable But now we've had a very strong wake-up call. Rising prices in many of the food staples and a lack of availability and accessibility for many of the most vulnerable and for the poor, and particularly in Africa.
It affects so many levels. There are families with AIDS who can't take the medicine if they don't have food, because the medicines are too powerful for their immune system to be able to be handled on an empty stomach. The children can't focus in class if they haven't been fed properly. People just basically can't survive.
Let me focus on an area in poor countries that I don't think we've really touched on here today, and that is not so much the issue of whether they can get the food, but the question of whether they can continue their own food production operations. There are some countries where the economies are essentially almost totally dependent on food production. Now they find themselves in competition with agribusiness elsewhere in the Western world. They can't even sell their food products if they wanted to improve their own economies. How much of a problem is that in the poorest countries of the world?
We need a much greater investment in agriculture, as Joachim has been saying and as he's been writing for some years now. And we need to focus on agriculture to get the right policies in place.
In the West or in poor countries?
Both, but particularly in poor countries. I remember India, 1965, monsoon failure. We had to ship a fifth of the U.S. wheat crop to India to avoid famine. But then there were a number of reforms. They had a ceiling price in agriculture to hold commodity prices down, which discouraged investment. They switched to a support price so farmers would know they'd get a minimum price when they harvested their crops, and they invested heavily. India doubled its wheat harvest in 7 years. No country has ever doubled the production of a major crop in such a short period of time. But there was, again, a perfect storm of things coming together. The high-yielding wheats and rices, the dwarf wheats and rices, expanding fertilizer use, farmers drilling irrigation wells by the millions, everything coming together to expand production. That was the first green revolution that Joachim referred to. Now we're talking about a second green revolution, but it's not quite clear where the technologies will come from to get those quantum jumps of the sort we got back then.
Joachim, are poor countries going to be able to invest in the kind of technology, agriculture technology that they need, and then are they going to be able to sell their products?
You see, the great decision which is really necessary is in poor countries to focus a lot more on agriculture and on nutrition. The same as was mentioned by Henrietta Fore in her statement, the development aid agencies have to come back to that agenda or move forward to that agenda. And that is no miracle to move in that direction. It takes about 10% of budget of government budgets in order to accelerate agriculture growth. It takes about $14 billion a year of international development aid. $14 billion sounds like a big number, but compared to any other expenditures, which the U.S. or any industrialized nation spends. So that's needed in order to avoid what Josette Chiron said, to get out of this vicious cycle of smaller and smaller and less healthy diets. The developing countries, especially Africa, have shown some progress, actually, with agricultural productivity growth in the years 2007 and 2008. African agriculture grew by 5, 6, 7% over the last 3 years. It came up. So we have to let these incentives work. Public investment has to come and accelerate the agricultural growth, and we need a dual strategy. We all have simultaneously to facilitate the improved nutrition program. So it's not only agriculture which is needed to grow us out of the crisis, but it is also the public investments in health and nutrition.
I just want to touch again on a point both of you have made already, and that is the competition between environmental issues and food crisis issues. For the first time, really, I guess we're seeing those things working at cross purposes with one another. Is that going to make it harder in the West to persuade people that, no, they shouldn't use a bushel of grain to fuel their SUV, and that they should focus on food issues rather than on energy issues?
Well, we need to focus on energy issues to get carbon emissions down, because climate change is one of the wild card in the food security deck, and it's very difficult to anticipate. But the idea that there's competition between meeting environmental goals and meeting food and nutrition goals is not real. If we can't protect agriculture's support systems, soils and aquifers and grasslands and so forth, then we won't be able to reach our nutrition goal.
Let's talk about solutions a little bit. If the crisis is worse than ever, who does hold the key for this, solving the problem of food for the people and the poorest nations who can't do it for themselves? Let's hear what some of our experts have to say about that.
I think that it is in the West, and particularly in the U.S., that we have the capability, the entrepreneurial capability and the technological capability to find better ways to produce more food more quickly.
We've also been working with a number of the research institutions around the world to get more nutritious foods out. So cassava is one, and we've been working on drought-resistant corn and wheat. We've been looking at ways to reduce wheat stem rust, and all of these are part of a global solution.
In our case, we are working with 600,000 farmers all over the world directly, bringing them know-how, bringing them technical assistance, bringing them microcredit.
We're really attacking this from a fundraising perspective. We're raising money in all of our restaurants. We're attacking it from building an awareness of the issue perspective. When you think about just the visibility we have with our customer base around the world with 35,000 restaurants, we're bringing awareness to an issue that needs to be solved.
We know how to end global hunger. And so we're really spending full time to try to bring together an alliance that can unite together to say hunger is out of business.
Josette Sheeran said, we know how to end global hunger. That seems so obvious, and Jeffrey Sachs is sort of famous for having said, we could solve this problem. It won't take that much. Joachim, you talked about $14 billion in one case.
Extra every year until 2015 in order to cut hunger in half. Doesn't solve the problem, at least cuts it in half.
Is it reasonable to say to the West, you've got the money, you've got the scientific expertise, you've got the business expertise. Can that solve the problem?
No. I think we need a few more ingredients.
Should the UN take this issue over, or what do you mean by global?
It has. The Secretary General of the UN has put himself in the chair of a task force. That was, I think, an excellent action. He didn't delegate it, and the various UN agencies have come together in a totally new way. I think that's hardly talked about, but that's good news. So we see good concerted action, but it is firefighting action. We don't have an architecture that prevents food crisis. We have to act much earlier. So we need much stronger preparedness with good information, investment mobilization, and especially rebuilding trust, and correcting early the type of policy errors which Lester referred to, the misguided biofuels policy.
Lester, let me ask you a final question, which is, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, the nations that have it in their power to apply their technological expertise, their governance expertise, their agricultural expertise, and their money don't seem to have the strong incentive to solve the problem. It's a political conundrum. How do you get people who aren't starving to essentially engage in a massive effort of the kind Joachim was just talking about to fix this problem for the rest of the world?
One of the things I don't think we've realized yet is that the number of failing states in the world is getting longer each year. The Somalias, the Haitis, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Afghanistan, now Pakistan. There's a long list getting longer all the time. One of the stresses on governments is rising food prices. And what we have to begin thinking or realizing is that food security is now national security. It's becoming a security issue from the U.S. And the encouraging thing is that the The military thinkers in the Pentagon and in the U.S. intelligence agencies are now beginning to identify hunger and poverty as threats to future political stability and therefore to U.S. security and U.S. interests around the world.
Lester Brown, president and founder of the Earth Policy Institute in Washington and founder of the World Watch Institute, and Joachim von Braun, the director general of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, previously director of a research center at the University of Bonn in Germany. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you, Ralph.
And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions. We'll see you next time. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.tv. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation. Great Decisions is produced in association with the University of Delaware.
Next time on Great Decisions, the soaring price of oil has forced unquestionable changes on the U.S. economy. Americans are behaving differently. They're driving and flying less. They're investing in green and renewable energy technology. But can we really change the way we power our lives anytime soon? Next time on Great Decisions.